We're just days away from the US presidential election. November 5th is the D-Day, the night when voting ends and counting begins. The race is between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, a vice president versus a former president. And it's a very close race. I know a lot of you have questions about how American elections work. So we're bringing you a special broadcast. How does the Electoral College work? Why does America always vote on a Tuesday? And why immigration is such a big debate this time? We'll be answering all these questions tonight. So let's get started. "240 million people are voting in this year's election, but the US president is not chosen directly by the voters. It's not a popular vote. Instead, they're chosen by the Electoral College. You see, each American state has a fixed number of electoral votes. That's according to the state's population. Whoever wins the state wins all the electoral votes. The Electoral College has a total of 538 votes. A candidate needs 270 or more to win. So it's a complicated system, and one that's gotten some pushback in the recent years. We'll tell you why.
On the 5th of November, millions of voters in the United States will cast their ballot to elect their next president. However, there's a catch. The world's oldest democracy does not hold elections which can be considered as the easiest to understand. In fact, the American voting system is quite complicated. Now, most democracies in the world follow something that's called the popular vote, where voters directly cast their ballots to a political party or leader. It's a direct transfer of the vote from the voter to whoever is on the ballot. But the United States does not follow this. In fact, it's the only democracy in the world that has an indirect voting system called the Electoral College. Simply put, the Electoral College is a process of voting. It's not really a college. It was established in 1787 AD and was included in the US Constitution by the Founding Fathers. The Electoral College is basically the selection of electors who are called delegates. On the 5th of November, when Americans will queue up to vote, they won't actually be voting for their next president. Instead, they'll actually be voting for delegates who represent their respective states, and these delegates will then vote for the president. So, how does the Electoral College work? The Electoral College is made up of 538 delegates. You must be wondering where the number 538 comes from. It's the number of senators and representatives from each of the 50 states. The breakdown of 538 includes exactly 100 senators, 2 from each state, and 438 representatives from the 50 states. Each state's number of representatives is based on its population. Let's take a closer look with an example. California and Texas are the two most populous states, and so they have a higher number of representatives. However, regardless of the population of the states, each of them gets 3 votes to start with. The remaining are then added depending on the population of the state. However, that does not mean that the states with a higher population enjoy more voting rights. In fact, it can be quite the opposite. Let's take the example of 2 states. The population of Texas is over 29 million. On the other hand, Alaska has a much smaller population of just above 700,000. However, each representative from Texas and Alaska roughly represents the same proportion of the population. So, as Texas gets 38 representatives in the US Congress, Alaska gets 3. And this makes voting different in Texas and Alaska, because each of the 38 delegates from Texas now represent roughly over 760,000 people. Meanwhile, each delegate from Alaska represents over 250,000 people. Basically, it takes 760,000 people from Texas to get 1 vote, but it just takes 250,000 people from Alaska to get that same 1 vote. so the vote in Alaska can be considered a lot more influential. When Americans go to polls in November, they aren't exactly voting for the president directly, but their state's representatives, whether that's Democrat or Republican. And then these delegates give their votes to the presidential candidate from their party. Whichever candidate then wins the majority in a state, no matter how big or small it may be, wins all the electoral votes of that state. And in total, to win the race to the Oval Office, a candidate must win 270 and more votes across 50 states. So when Americans say this,
I love her. I am so glad to see a presidential nominee who is youthful and joyful, and I think that reflects right back onto the Democrats. My first time voting in a presidential election, and I could not be happier.
I don't know the exact numbers, but I know the last election, I think Trump got like 88 or 90% of the vote here. I think he's going to get that again.
The courts will take care of that. Let's take care of him in November.
what they really mean is that they will vote for the delegates who represent their political party. And then, those delegates will vote for the presidential candidate from their respective parties.
Kamala, you are fired! You're fired! Get out! Get out!
It's time to turn the page.
However, the delegates don't have to necessarily vote for the candidate that the population wants to give its vote to. In fact, electors are free to vote against the wishes of the people. And this is despite having been elected as a delegate by the voters. So, with how complex the electoral system is, should the US continue with it or adapt the much simpler popular voting system? A survey from 2023 shows that a majority of Americans want to do away with the Electoral College. A Pew Research study shows that nearly 2/3 of US citizens want popular voting. Americans say that it would truly reflect the mood of the nation for who should sit in the Oval Office. That's because a presidential candidate could win the popular vote, which means that more people voted for them, but they could lose the presidential race due to the Electoral College, where the victor is decided by the number of delegates and not the votes of the people. The Pew study has some more insights on the issue. It says that Democrats are far more likely than Republicans to support moving to the popular vote. On aggregate, over 80% of Democrats say that they would like to have the popular voting system in America. In contrast, about 45% of Republicans share the same sentiments. Moving away from party ideologies and towards demographies, almost 70% of Americans under the age of 50 prefer the popular vote. On the other hand, Americans who are 65 and older want the Electoral College to continue.
A very nice call from Kamala.
The current system allows a candidate to lose the popular vote but still win the Electoral College. This occurred both in the 2000 and the 2016 elections, which were won by George W. Bush and Donald Trump, respectively. However, the only way to change the Electoral College would be through a constitutional amendment. But amending the Constitution is a Herculean task. The last time it was done was in the year 1992, and it was about raising salaries for congressional lawmakers. So, for now, it looks like Americans will have to keep voting using the Electoral College to elect their president.
Now, America has 50 states. Some of them are red, which means that they've always voted Republicans. Some are blue, which means they vote for the Democrats. But some of them are called swing states. They either vote for the Democrats or the Republicans. They keep changing. These swing states decide who becomes president. And there are 7 of them. Our next report tells you all about them.
Kamala mentioned my name, I think, 21 times. She didn't mention the border. She didn't mention inflation. She didn't mention anything but my name over and over and over again.
The countdown to the 5th of November is on, with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump vying for the Oval Office. So, who will become America's next president? While around 240 million people will vote to pick the United States' 47th Commander-in-Chief, a relatively small number of them are likely to settle this pivotal question. A handful of the 50 states could hold the key to the White House. These are called the swing states. As the name goes, they could swing either Democrat or Republican. They're also known as battleground states or purple states. They could potentially be won by either candidate. So parties tend to spend disproportionate amount of time, resources and energy on bagging these states. One way to identify swing states is political realignment, and the other is tight margins in races. In 2020, the states that voted for current President Joe Biden, who's a Democrat, but chose former Republican President Donald Trump in 2016, have been highlighted as swing states. They are Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. These 5 states, along with North Carolina and Nevada, were won by a margin of 3 percentage points or less. Both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump's campaigns have been at full throttle to win over the voters in these states. Let's look at each swing state in the 2024 US presidential election. Arizona, also known as the Grand Canyon State. In the 2020 race, Arizona, for the first time since 1996, voted to back a Democrat. For decades, the state has been characterized as red, but Joe Biden flipped it by about 10,000 votes in 2020. The state borders Mexico, so it has been at the center of a raging immigration debate. The issue has been a top concern among voters. Though border crossings have fallen in recent months, they hit a record high in December 2023 and January 2024. But Donald Trump has repeatedly attacked Vice President Harris on the current administration's record on immigration. The former US president has also promised the largest deportation operation in US history if he's back in the White House. Apart from immigration, abortion access has also left Arizona divided. State Republicans attempted to bring back a 160-year-old near-complete ban on terminating pregnancies, but the move was foiled. Next up is Georgia, the Peach State. It's a critical battleground state for both leaders as they struggle to gain the voters' attention. In 2020, Joe Biden flipped the state, which was held by the Republicans since 1996. Biden won the state by a 0.2% margin. Though the margin was too little to call it a decisive win, it was key to Biden's path to the presidency. It was here in Georgia's Fulton County where Donald Trump was accused of election interference, landing him in one of his 4 criminal prosecutions. Trump and 18 others have been accused of conspiring to overturn the narrow defeat in the state. He, however, denies any wrongdoing. A third of Georgia's population is African American. The state has one of the country's largest proportions of black residents. Analysts say this demographic was pivotal in Joe Biden flipping the state in the last election. Moving now to Michigan, the Great Lakes state. It has picked the winning presidential candidate in the last 2 elections. Michigan had been reliably blue since 1992 after voting exclusively Republican in the 1970s and 80s. But in 2016, it turned into a major battleground after Trump won there by less than 11,000 votes. In 2020, Joe Biden swung the state back to blue with a wider margin. But currently, the state has become symbolic of countrywide anger against President Biden due to his support for Israel in its war against Gaza. During the Michigan Democratic primary contest in February, when Joe Biden was still running for a second term in office, over 100,000 voters chose uncommitted on their ballots. Kamala Harris has taken a slightly tougher stance on Israel. But whether it will be enough to change the voters' minds, well, we'll find out in November. Next is Nevada. The silver state has been a more traditional example of a swing state. In the last 4 elections, the state voted blue. But Nevada voted Republican from the 1960s through the early 2000s. The only exception was Bill Clinton, who won the state in 1992 and again in 96. Experts say there are signs of a possible return to its Republican roots. Both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are hoping to win the state's sizable Latino population. Unemployment is also one of the major concerns here. The state has the highest unemployment rate in the US at 5.1% after California and the District of Columbia. Then there's North Carolina, the Tar Heel state of the old North State. Since 1980, it has voted Republican in every single election except 2008, choosing Barack Obama. In recent presidential contests, the victory margins have been razor thin. In 2020, the victory margin in North Carolina was just 1.3%. Poll pundits say it will be a toss-up in November, since the race is extremely tight with no clear winner. The 6th on the list of swing states is Pennsylvania. With 19 electoral votes, it's the most important swing state this November. The Keystone State clinched the presidency for Joe Biden in 2020. The big question is, can Kamala Harris keep it blue? Both sides have campaigned hard in the state. Donald Trump even survived an assassination attempt here after a bullet dodged past him and hurt his ear. Donald Trump broke the blue streak in the state with his 2016 victory. But 4 years later, in 2020, Biden secured a blue wall that also included Michigan and Wisconsin. Now Trump is hoping to lure Pennsylvania voters back. The 7th and final one is Wisconsin, the Badger State. It also picked the winning candidate in both the 2016 and 2020 elections, but only by a margin of around 20,000 votes each time. Since 1988, Wisconsin had been a reliably blue Rust Belt state. Trump broke that streak in 2016 and turned it red. Analysts say it's states like Wisconsin where an impact could be made by third-party candidates. Among them is Green Party's Jill Stein. The Democrats have been fighting to remove her from the ballot in Wisconsin, saying that the Green Party did not comply with the state election laws. Republican candidate Donald Trump has described the state as really important. He said, and I quote, "If we win Wisconsin, we win the whole thing." The Republican National Convention was held in Milwaukee. Kamala Harris was also rallying in the same city when the Democratic Convention nominated her as their presidential candidate. In the United States, when a sitting president is up for a re-election, fewer states tend to change parties. In the past 8 US presidential elections, the 1992 election had the highest number of states that switched sides. 22 states flipped. It's often called the year of political realignment, when Democrat Bill Clinton defeated incumbent President George H. Bush. In 1992, states including Colorado, Maryland, and even California, which had voted Republican for years, chose to go blue, and then reliably stayed that way for the next decade. Can 2024 be another year of political realignment in US history? Well, we'll find out on the 5th of November.
Now let me ask you, who will be able to vote in the upcoming US election? Now, this question is not as simple as it seems. You see, more than 350 million people are living in the United States, but this includes green card holders, international students, and illegal migrants too, which is, by the way, a hot button topic in this election. Out of the 350 million people, only about 240 million people can cast their vote in the upcoming election. Does that include migrants? Why is citizenship a raging debate in the US presidential race? Also, what role does race play in this election? Here's a report.
As borders are, Kamala threw open our borders and allowed 20 million illegal aliens to stampede into our country from all over the world.
Every U.S. citizen has the right to vote. And this year, every eligible voter's ballot will decide who will be the next U.S. president. The 2024 race for the White House will see over 200 million Americans cast their vote.
I accept your nomination to be President of the United States of America.
However, there are over 350 million people living in the United States. So why isn't the number of eligible voters higher? And is voting restricted only to American citizens? Voting is a fundamental and guaranteed right to citizens of the United States. Only they are allowed to cast their ballot to be eligible. Here's what the requirements are. A person has to be a U.S. citizen. This could be through birth in the U.S., through birth overseas to parents who are U.S. citizens. Then there is the process of naturalization. It is the process of voluntarily becoming a U.S. citizen, and then you also have to be 18 years and older on voting day. If you meet these requirements, then you may register to become a voter and cast your ballot in the U.S. elections. So U.S. citizens can cast their vote and pick their next president. They can also pick their governors and mayors by voting in the state and local elections. But what about those who are not U.S. citizens but are living in the country? This includes people who are in America on work visas or those who have acquired lawful permanent resident status, also known as green cards. But what about the 50 million international tourists and the 1 million plus international students? And millions of illegal migrants? Can these people also cast their vote? Here's what the rules say. Lawful permanent residents or green card holders cannot vote in the federal elections. This includes the presidential, Senate, and House of Representatives races. Additionally, green card holders also cannot vote in state elections. That's because most U.S. states follow federal law. However, green card holders can exercise their voting rights in certain towns and cities where local law allows them to vote. States like Maryland and Vermont allow green card holders to vote. However, U.S. federal law allows green card holders to participate in other political activity. This can include volunteering in political campaigns or advocating for social issues. And what about the others? Well, apart from green card holders, international tourists, students, people on work visas, or illegal migrants cannot cast their ballot in either the federal, state, or local elections. However, they can take part in political events and campaigns, but only as volunteers. This brings us to the question, why is citizenship and voting a raging debate in the United States? It all started in February, when Tesla CEO and tech billionaire Elon Musk sparked a debate on his social media platform X. He questioned U.S. President Joe Biden's migration policy. Musk said that Biden purposely had weak borders so that millions of illegal migrants could enter the U.S. Musk added that the Biden administration would fast-track citizenship for those migrants and create a permanent majority, a one-party state. The billionaire said that this was the strategy of the Democrats to ensure that they win the 2024 presidential race. Musk's tweet was not taken seriously at the time, but that all changed in June, when Joe Biden announced that he would give citizenship to 500,000 people who are undocumented spouses of Americans but have been living in the United States for over 10 years and more.
Today I'm announcing a common-sense fix to streamline the process for obtaining legal status for immigrants.
And that's when the Republicans jumped on the matter. At least 16 Republican states are suing the Biden administration for this move. Elon Musk says the Democrats are importing voters. The Republican-led states argue that Biden has bypassed congressional laws to fast-track citizenship for blatant political purposes. However, the Democrats have hit back. Vice President Kamala Harris has called it Republican strategy to tear apart families. Harris has accused the Republicans of hindering the process of legalizing the migrant status of millions.
Donald Trump believes a border deal would hurt his campaign. So he ordered his allies in Congress to kill the deal. Well, I refuse to play politics with our security, and here is my pledge to you. As president, I will bring back the bipartisan border security bill that he killed, and I will sign it into law.
This brings us to the question, how easy is it to get voting rights as a migrant? And will Biden's citizenship policy benefit the Democrats? Joe Biden's citizenship eligibility program for spouses has crucial details about becoming a citizen. The program allows undocumented spouses of Americans who have lived in the U.S. for at least 10 years or more as of June 17, 2024. To apply for citizenship, they should have no criminal history and will have to provide extensive documentation of taxes and their marital status. Once the application is approved, the qualifying applicant will have 3 years to obtain a green card or risk deportation. And after getting a green card, they can apply for naturalization or full U.S. citizenship. This means that the almost 500,000 spouses of Americans will not be eligible to vote in this year's election. However, the Democrats are being criticized for pulling this move in an election year, which is in stark contrast to Donald Trump's proposal of mass deportations.
We will do large deportations.
Additionally, the path to U.S. citizenship takes roughly a decade. So the influx of immigrants during Biden's tenure will also not have a direct impact in this year's election. However, it will steer how Americans will vote this year, with border security remaining one of the top concerns. Meanwhile, both Elon Musk and Donald Trump continue to claim that the Democrats are signing up illegal migrants onto voter lists, even though they have not come forward with any evidence for their claims. Additionally, there is not enough research on whether migrants who get U.S. citizenship prefer to vote for Democrats or Republicans. So the fact still remains, despite these wild claims, that only American citizens choose their president.
The U.S. goes to polls on November 5th. The country will choose its next president. It will either be Kamala Harris from the Democratic Party or Donald Trump from the Republican Party. While there are other third-party candidates, the real race is between these two. So, who will vote for Harris? And who will try and bring Trump back to power?
Too much competition.
Right.
One way to look at potential voters is through the lens of race. The U.S. is home to more than 333 million people. This is according to the last census, taken in 2022. Now, let's break up that figure by race. About 58.9% of the U.S. population identifies as white. About 19.1% are Hispanic. Black people make up 12.6% of the U.S. population. Then, you have people of Asian descent who make up 6.1%. 2.4% of America is multiracial. 0.7% are Native American people. And Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders make up 0.2% of the population. That's the demographic breakup of the U.S. population according to the 2022 census. Let's look at the 4 biggest demographic groups, the ones most likely to influence the 2024 election. You have white people, Hispanic people, Black people, and people of Asian descent. In the last few U.S. elections, these 4 groups have made up 96 to 98% of the U.S. electorate. Look at this chart to see the composition of voters. You'll notice that it doesn't correspond to the population breakup. Even though white Americans make up less than 60% of the population, about 74% of the people who vote are white. This means white people have a disproportionately high say in the election compared to their population. Black voters come close to representing their share of the U.S. population, but Hispanic people and people of Asian descent do not have a proportional say. They have historically been underrepresented at the ballot box. So, while the 4 major racial groups do decide U.S. elections, white people have the biggest say by far. So how do the different American racial groups usually vote? We'll look at the last 4 elections for clues. These are the 2016 presidential election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, then the 2018 midterms, the 2020 presidential election between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and then the 2022 midterms. Here's the voter breakup by race for these elections. The most obvious difference is the percentage of white voters. White voters have made up about 62% of the Democratic Party's voter base. This is across the last 4 elections. In contrast, white people made up about 87% of the Republican Party's voter base. They are the driving force behind the Republicans, and it seems more white people vote for the GOP than for the Democrats. This has consistently been the case. Let's zoom in on the last election. In the 2022 midterms, 57% of all white voters choose the Republican Party. 41% voted for the Democrats, and 2% cast their votes elsewhere. So Republicans have the edge when it comes to white voters. But that edge is blunted when the black vote comes into play. Let's look at the 2022 midterm statistics again. A whopping 93% of all black voters chose the Democrats. 93%. And remember, black people are relatively well represented at the ballot box. So we can say that most black Americans vote blue. This has been proven time and again. In the last 4 elections, black people on average made up more than 17% of the Democratic Party's voter base. 17% versus only 1% on average for the Republican Party. Now we look at Hispanic people. They make up almost 20% of the US population. But when it comes to voting, they only make up about 9% of the electorate. It shows that Hispanic people are very underrepresented at the polling booth. But this 9% is still significant. It can turn the tide of any election. So Hispanic people are definitely a key demographic in the US. Like black voters, Hispanic voters traditionally lean towards the Democrats, but the difference in party choice is far less pronounced. Between 2016 and 2022, Hispanic people made up about 12% of the Democratic voter base on average. For the Republicans, this number was about half. About 6% of Republican voters over the last few elections have been Hispanic people. It's a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of the Democrats. But these numbers aren't set in stone. You'll notice that over time, Hispanic support for the Democrats has stagnated, whereas it has gone up for the Republicans. The swing is still minor, but this year's election could solidify the migration. And it proves that America's Hispanic population still has a big say in elections, even if it isn't proportional to the community's size. Then we have the people of Asian descent, America's fastest growing demographic. They make up only 6.1% of the population right now, according to the 2022 census. But that's 27% higher than the proportion of Asian people in 2010. So the population of Asian people in the US grew by 27% between 2010 and 2022. That's much faster than any other demographic group. If this growth continues, people of Asian descent will continue to have a greater say in American politics as the years go by. Historically, this is another group that has leaned towards the Democrats, even more than Hispanic people. In 2022, 68% of all Asian Americans voted blue, compared to 60% of all Hispanic voters. So both the groups lean towards the Democratic Party, but Asian Americans slightly more so. People of Asian descent made up about 4% of the Democratic Party's voter base over the last 4 elections. That fell to about 2% for the Republicans. But again, there's a caveat here. In 2016 and 2018, barely any Asian Americans voted red. But in the 2020 presidential elections, Asian American support for the Republicans surged. They made up 3% of the Republican voter base. It was a historic high. With Trump contesting again, more Asian Americans might be tempted to vote red once more.
Thank you, everybody.
So that's how the biggest racial groups in the US usually vote. White people lean towards the Republicans. Black people overwhelmingly vote for the Democrats. Hispanic people and people of Asian descent have historically voted in favor of the Democrats as well. But the gap seems to be narrowing. And this should worry Kamala Harris and encourage Donald Trump.
In the last few weeks, opinion polls have been dominating the headlines. In July, Kamala Harris had a comfortable lead in the polls, but those gains have since been erased. Trump and Harris are neck and neck in the latest polls. But the question remains, can opinion polls really predict the election result? Do they accurately predict a result? The 2016 opinion poll got it wrong. The 2020 opinion poll was off in its predictions. Will the 2024 opinion poll get it right?
On November 5th, all eyes will be on America. The country will head to the ballot box, and they have a choice to make: Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. Who will the United States choose?
I accept your nomination to be President of the United States of America.
I am running to be President for all of America, not half of America.
Now, no one can predict the election results. We will only know when it's declared. But behind the votes, there's another story. A story of numbers, statistics, and predictions. The story of polls. We hear about them during every presidential election. In some states, Donald Trump is leading. In the others, it's Kamala Harris. These polls are crucial to each election. They shape narratives. They influence campaigns. And sometimes, they even leave the entire nation baffled. In 2016 and 2020, the polls got it wrong. Can they get it right this time? And what do these opinion polls mean for the American democracy? The year was 1948. The date was November 3rd. This was the front page of the Chicago Daily Tribune. It read, "Dewey defeats Truman." But here's the catch. Thomas E. Dewey did not win that election. Harry S. Truman did. So, why did the paper print that headline? A year before the elections, the Chicago Daily Tribune had changed the way it printed its paper. So, the copy needed to go to print earlier. That was the case, too, on that night. Most states had not declared their results, but the paper took a leap of faith. After all, every poll said that Dewey would win. So, they went ahead with this copy. It went to press. But by next morning, it was a completely different result. The polls predicted a Dewey win. Instead, it was a Truman triumph. He even posed with the Chicago Daily Tribune copy. Now, polling has been a part of American elections for over a century. It started with simple straw polls. As technology advanced, so did the methods. Now, they are complex statistical analyses. So, how do the polls work? It's all about three things: data, sampling, and the art of asking the right questions. At its core, a poll is a survey. It's a way to measure the opinions of a specific group. But in a country as large and diverse as the United States, it's impossible to ask everyone. So, pollsters rely on sampling. Age, gender, race, location. These are all factors that are considered before building a sample. Then, there are the methods. How do you contact the sample group? Pollsters use landlines, cell phones, and online surveys. Each method has its advantages and drawbacks. More importantly, each one can influence the outcome of the poll. For example, imagine it's an online survey. Chances are the answers will come from a younger generation. Also, chances are they will be more educated. So, pollsters must keep that in mind. Once the data is collected, it's analyzed. It is then adjusted for various factors like non-response bias, which occurs when survey participants either can't or won't respond to a survey question. finally, it is presented to the public as the polls that we see. So it's a science, but one with inherent uncertainties. Take 1980, for example, Jimmy Carter versus Ronald Reagan. Polls predicted a close race. However, Reagan won by a landslide. So, why did the polls go wrong? It's the voter sentiment in the end. Reagan performed well in the presidential debate that was held a week before the election. It convinced many undecided voters. They ended up voting for him, and the polls completely missed this. Then there's 2000, George W. Bush versus Al Gore. Many polls predicted an Al Gore win. Now, while Gore did win the popular vote, the outcome depended on the Electoral College. Polls underestimated that. It did not take into consideration the razor-thin margins in key states. So it was a blot on the reputation of polls. But 2016 really changed the game. It's when America woke up to how wrong these polls could be. Polls predicted an overwhelming victory for Hillary Clinton. Yet on election night, Donald Trump emerged as the 45th president of the United States. So what went wrong? Well, there are several factors at play. The first was the underestimation of Trump's support in key battleground states. Pollsters missed crucial pockets of voters. That's the rural, white working class. They turned out in larger numbers than expected. The second was education levels. Non-educated voters weren't well represented in the samples, and they turned out to be pivotal in Trump's victory. The third was late deciding voters, those who swung towards Trump in the final days of the campaign. Polls didn't capture this last-minute shift. But here was the biggest issue: the failure to account for this shy Trump voter. These voters supported Trump, but were reluctant to declare it. Hillary may have lost the election, but the biggest loser of 2016 were the pollsters. So 4 years later, the polling industry vowed to learn from its mistakes. In 2020, the polls once again predicted a clear winner. It was Joe Biden. This time, the prediction was correct, but there was an issue. The margin was far narrower than expected. Despite making adjustments, pollsters underestimated Trump's support again. The problems were the same as 2016. So, what will it be in 2024? Pollsters are now looking at new technologies: AI, big data, and social media analytics. They want to use it to improve accuracy. But will it be enough? Will pollsters get it right this time? Or will they be wrong for the third time? Whatever the answer is, one thing is clear: polls will remain a critical part of the presidential elections, but they are not infallible. And in the end, it's the people, not the polls, who ultimately decide who will be in the White House.
The US will elect its 47th president on November 5th, which is a Tuesday. They elected their 46th president on November 3rd in 2020, which was also a Tuesday. What about the 45th and the 44th presidents? Let me cut to the chase. Over the past 175 years, the US has always elected its president on a Tuesday, more specifically on the Tuesday following the first Monday in the month of November, every 4 years. When did this become a polling tradition and why? Our next report tells you.
If there's one thing the year 2024 will be remembered for, it'll be elections. From India to Britain, the European Union to South Korea, South Africa, Finland, France, Taiwan, and even Russia. Over 60 nations held elections this year. However, it's not over yet. One last global election remains. And it's just around the corner. The United States, the world's oldest modern democracy, is set to vote this November. Americans will be choosing their 47th president. And running for the White House are former President Donald Trump and current Vice President Kamala Harris. The presidential race in the US happens every 4 years. However, there is something constant in each election that has remained unchanged for over 175 years, and that is the day of the week when the elections are held: Tuesday. This year as well, Americans will be voting on November 5th, which is also a Tuesday. So why is Tuesday connected to America's democracy? Well, it's a bit of coincidence and tradition. The election day in the United States has been set in stone by federal law. The U.S. law calls for a presidential poll to be held on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. But how did the November Tuesday become so important for U.S. democracy? Let's find out. The U.S. Constitution does not designate a specific day for holding elections. However, it allows Congress to select the time and day for choosing electors or delegates. These delegates, in turn, vote to elect the president and vice president. The Constitution also gives some rights to the states to choose the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives. However, it also permits Congress to make or alter those state rules. So if the day hasn't been fixed, then how did Tuesday come into the picture? The U.S. declared itself independent from Britain in 1776. The United States ratified its Constitution in 1788. This was followed by the first elections that were held between November of 1788 and June 1789. Yes, voting that is now done within one day took up to 6 months when it first began. And subsequent elections continued to be chaotic. Things changed more than 5 decades later when the 1840 presidential election saw widespread voting fraud. In response, then Representative Alexander Duncan proposed a uniform election day for both presidential and House elections in 1844. The bill initially sought to require all states to hold their elections on a single day. That is on Tuesday after the first Monday in November. While the House passed the bill, the Senate didn't table it before the 1844 election. Alexander Duncan reintroduced the bill in the next session, this time focusing solely on the presidential election. Various amendments were proposed during the bill's consideration. Ultimately, the House adopted the bill, and the Senate passed it with minor corrections. The bill was signed into law on January 23, 1845, by President John Tyler, making Tuesday the official day for Americans to vote for their president. But the mystery remains: why choose a Tuesday? Historians say the answer lies in 19th-century American lifestyle. The choice of Tuesday in November is deeply rooted on the country's agrarian culture of the time. November was ideal because it followed the completion of the harvest season. The month also avoided conflicts with both planting in the spring and early fall. This meant that farmers could plant their crop and travel to vote, which would take days in those times. Additionally, Tuesday was chosen due to religious reasons. In Christian practice, the term Sabbath is often used to refer to Sunday. It recognizes the day of Jesus Christ's resurrection, and many Christians would observe a weekly day of rest and worship on Sunday. In the 19th century, polling stations were quite far from rural areas, and for voters, particularly farmers, it meant at least a day-long journey. So to avoid forcing people to travel on the holy day of Sabbath, Monday was not considered, and Wednesday, which was designated as the market day for farmers, was also rejected. Naturally, Tuesday emerged as the prime choice and eventually became the official day. However, Tuesday as an election day has had its fair share of opposition. Modern-day political experts say that voting on a weekend would see an increase in turnout. They argue that holding election on a Tuesday hinders voter access due to work commitments. One of the organizations leading the cause to reassign voting day is called Why Tuesday? Founded in 2005, the group raises awareness about America's low voter turnout. It aims to highlight the lack of accessible voting options, and they are leading the fight to move election day to the weekend. Many countries hold elections on weekends. Australia, Germany, France, and Japan generally conduct elections on Saturdays or Sundays. Brazil votes on the first Sunday of October, with runoffs on the last Sunday if needed. Meanwhile, Mexico shifted from the first Sunday of July to the first Sunday of June from 2021. The European Union also typically holds its parliament election on a weekend. However, in the Anglosphere, such as the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada, elections are typically held on weekdays. It is influenced by historical Christian practice of observing Sabbath. Meanwhile, in India, elections occur over multiple days with different phases for various constituencies. In the case of the United States, it's worth noting that while federal elections are on a Tuesday, state and local elections have more flexibility. However, many states align their elections with the federal date simply for convenience. On November 5th, the Tuesday after the first Monday of November, millions of Americans will line up at polling booths. They will exercise their fundamental right of self-governance. As for the Tuesday election day, the law that has continued for over 175 years faces little opposition and will likely remain for many more years to come.
They say clothes make a person, but when it comes to elections, clothes can also help make a president. And both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump know this. They're both using fashion as a soft power, from power suits to longer ties and brighter colors. How are Harris and Trump dressing to become the next commander-in-chief? And why does it matter? Also, is it a level playing field? Our next report discusses this.
This is the U.S. presidential race, where numbers matter, policies matter, but so do the optics. This is a grand theater of politics, where, like with any theatrical display, amid the pomp and pageantry, costumes can make all the difference. Why is that? And how do the candidates use it to their advantage?
Her biggest advantage is that she's a beautiful woman.
Don't you find some of their stuff to just be plain weird?
I'm a better looking person than Kamala.
Well, Donald, I do hope you'll reconsider.
August 23rd. This was one of the most consequential days for Kamala Harris, when she accepted her nomination as the Democratic candidate for president.
We can do together. We are so honored to be your nominees. This is a people-powered campaign, and together we will chart a new way forward.
While this happened, many women at the Democratic National Convention were wearing white. So were many other speakers. But Harris chose to wear blue. This wasn't just to stand out of the crowd. After all, a presidential candidate doesn't have to try very hard to do that. Here, her navy blue suit had symbolic meaning.
America's ready for a better story. We are ready for a President Kamala Harris.
To understand this, let's go back. The year was 2016. History was made in the United States. The first woman candidate was nominated for president, Hillary Clinton. Clinton had climbed up the stage in a white suit. Why white? Because for her, this was symbol of all the women before her who fought for a political voice. From the suffragists to Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman vice presidential candidate. Since that moment in 2016, the white pantsuit is a symbolic weapon in the US. It is a political trope. Harris has used this weapon once before. In 2020, when US President Joe Biden declared the election victory, Harris became the first woman vice president of the United States. And she chose to wear white, again, in honor of the women who came before her.
I know where I stand, and I know where the United States belongs.
But this time, as Harris accepted her presidential nomination, she wore blue to close a chapter and stand out on her own terms. Because for her, wearing suits is not just an easy, obvious choice. It is tactical. Suits have become her uniform since before her days of vice presidency. Harris has appeared in neutral pantsuits, usually in shades of black, dark blue, burgundy, and beige. Now, power suits are kind of the go-to for US presidential candidates, so Hillary Clinton did it as well, as a self-described pantsuit aficionado, but usually in rainbow colors. This was her way to bridge the male-female fashion divide. But this doesn't mean everyone wears suits. Like former Republican presidential contender
Miss Nikki Haley!
She often wore dresses and skirts, especially during the Republican presidential debates, mainly to differentiate herself and stand out among the other Republican hopefuls. But why are we talking about this? Why does it matter what women presidential candidates wear? First, because they are in the presidential race, and a president doesn't dress to represent themselves, but the country, so the stakes are high. And secondly, because they are women. Studies show that when voters are asked to close their eyes and picture a US president, most of them come up with the same image, a white man.
Well, folks, it's time to turn the page.
So voters don't know what a woman in office looks like, let alone a potentially pioneering woman president, if elected.
I've served with her. I know her. I trust her.
Harris will be the first female president, the first female president of color, and the first president of South Asian descent.
But while I may be the first woman in this office, I will not be the last.
So voters don't know what a woman president will or should look like. But research confirms that they scrutinize a woman president's appearance more than a male candidate's. For instance, a flyaway hair is an indication of sloppy thinking. Is this unfair? Of course. Even former US President Barack Obama acknowledged the double standard when he spoke about Hillary Clinton. He said,
"She had to do everything that I had to do, except, like Ginger Rogers, backward in heels. She had to wake up earlier than I did because she had to get her hair done. She had to, handle all the expectations that were placed on her."
And we witnessed the proof. When Clinton didn't do this, when she tied her hair in a ponytail, it led to an entire debate about the meaning of the scrunchie. So, as things stand, how Harris equips herself for the role matters, and better yet, she can use it to her advantage, and she has. Like when Harris wore 3 different black designers for President Biden's inauguration. But it is not just Harris who needs to worry about fashion. So does Donald Trump. The Republican presidential candidate Trump is almost always in a suit. By the Italian luxury brand Brioni, with a broad-shouldered tailoring.
And a tie.
And this tie is a tactical play as well. It is really long, which experts say is worn that way to make him look taller and thinner. And it is almost always red.
Why?
Because put together with a suit and tie, Trump looks like a walking, talking American flag. This is the look. His signature red tie, his white shirt, and his blue suit. Trump embraces these patriotic hues more than any of his predecessors.
Happy birthday, President Trump.
And the flag seems to be his muse. Because, fun fact, Trump's birthday falls on June 14, which also happens to be Flag Day in the US. Now, Trump wore the same combination even before he entered politics. But over time, his uniform has evolved.
I am the chosen one. Somebody had to do it.
The blue has become brighter in recent months, and the red ties have become even more common. Now, he is not alone here. Former US President Ronald Reagan was also known for his red ties. This was symbolic of his Republican representation. But no one loves it like Trump. He does switch it up though, like during his New York hush money trial. He wore blue and gold ties. He was taking space from his political uniform. But he always reverts to the combination during the high-stakes events. He wore it in 2016, when he won the presidency. He wore it for his first official news conference as the president, for State of the Union addresses in 2019 and 2020, for his speech at January 6th rally in 2021, for his exit from the White House in 2021, for his mug shot, and even for his first official TikTok post. He wears the flag. He is surrounded by flags.
Why?
Experts say it is a visual representation of patriotism and nationalism. So, when people see him, they see the flag. So, in the run-up to November 5th, both Trump and Harris are using fashion as a soft power, albeit differently. But they both have the same goal. They have each devised their own wardrobe language. They are both power dressing for the job they want, to be the President of the United States, arguably the most powerful person in the world.
Well, that's all on this US election special. Don't forget to tune into Firstpost for all the election updates. Vantage will be coming to you live from the White House in Washington, D.C. starting next week.